Since the start of the century, the fortunes of Russia have ebbed and flowed. So too the country's relations with the West. But throughout there has been one constant: Vladimir Putin. Since taking power at the end of 1999, first as president, then as prime minister, then as president again, Putin has built a Russia in his own image. The first part of his rule saw an economic rebound and rising living standards. At the same time, Putin asserted his authority internationally after a decade of post-Soviet humiliation. But economic pain was to come with the resource-rich nation being hit by falling oil prices. At the same time, relations with the West came under strain. The Kremlin's intervention in Ukraine saw Russia hit with sanctions that still stand. What hurts Mr. Putin abroad helps him at home, and the standoff has only boosted his popularity in Russia. In a country where power and strength are prized, the president's publicity plays to this. At 80%, his approval rating is at a level very few Western leaders could even dream of. But despite his popularity and the psychological position as Russia's ultimate guardian, it's an election year at the parliamentary level, and the country's economy is still yet to recover. The Russians heading to the polls this year for the parliament, and then again the presidency looming in 2018, I sat down with President Putin for an exclusive conversation. President Putin, thank you very much for talking to Bloomberg. You have studied and watched the West many times. You've been to the G20 more than any other leader at the moment. Have you ever been to a G20 where the West has seen more divided, more in doubt, more distrustful of itself? You look at all the things happening in Europe, the migration, you look at the Brexit, you look in America with all the election and the problems with that. Does the West seem particularly disunited at the moment to you? And what do you explain that by?
There are many problems in the world economy on the whole, and the West's economy also has a lot of problems. An aging population, declining growth rates of productivity rates. These are obvious things. On the whole, these demographics are very difficult. Then perhaps experts, and you are one of the best experts in this subject, believe that the EU's expansion policy didn't account for the readiness of this or that economy to join the Eurozone, allowing, for example, admission into a single currency to those with reasonably weak economic indicators. And it's very difficult to support growth rates, but the economy itself under such testing conditions. We in Europe weren't the only ones to go through this. For example, we know in Argentina how 10 years or maybe more ago they tightly pegged the national currency to the dollar and then didn't know what to do. And that's what entering the Eurozone was like.
Do you expect the euro to survive?
I hope so. I hope so because, first of all, we believe in the fundamental basis of the European economy. We see that Western European leaders, despite disagreements, of course, in general, maintain, I can't say right or wrong, that depends on what side you look at it from, very pragmatic approaches to resolving economic issues and do not abuse financial instruments or financial injections. They primarily strive for structural changes that, in fact, are no less acute in our economy, or perhaps even more so. I'm referring to a problem that we can't overcome, specifically the dominant role of the oil and gas sector in Russia, and, as a result, dependence on oil and gas revenue. But Europe also has not a dependence on oil and gas, But the time for structural reforms long ago came. And I think that the leading economies have a very pragmatic approach to resolving the economic problems facing Europe. That is why we hold about 40% of our reserves in euros.
Мы и держим примерно 40% наших золотовалютных резервов в евро.
You expect the euro to survive, and you expect Europe to keep the existing membership. They're not going to lose any more. They're not going to lose another country like they lost Britain.
Вы знаете, это я не хочу.
You know, I don't want to respond to your provocative question, even though I understand that it could be interesting.
Come on, you many times you criticize Europe. You could take some.
Да, я критиковал, но повторяю еще раз, мы держим 40%.
I have been critical, but I again repeat.
В евро, и мы не заинтересованы.
We hold 40% of our reserves in euro, and it's not in our interest for the eurozone to collapse. Even though I don't rule out that there could be some decisions made that would consolidate a group of countries with equal levels of development, and thereby, in my opinion, strengthening the euro.
Могут быть какие-то и другие промежуточные решения.
But there might be some other interim decisions in order to preserve the existing number of members in the Eurozone.
Это не наша задача.
That's not our goal, but we always very attentively monitor and wish our European partners success. What you said about criticism, I criticize their foreign policy, but that doesn't mean that we should agree on everything. We have criticized many things and believe that our partners have made more than a few mistakes, as probably we have too. Nobody is safe from these mistakes, but in regards to the economy, I'll say it again. In my opinion, the European Commission and the leading economies of Europe are acting pragmatically and are on the right track.
Can I ask you about the oil price, your favourite subject? Almost 2 years ago, you said that if crude oil fell below $80 a barrel, there would be a collapse in oil production. Well, the price is still below $50 and production hasn't stopped. Has your thinking changed on that at all?
Ну, если я говорил, что добыча нефти.
Well, if I said that oil output would end, then I was mistaken.
Видимо, с горяча, но, по-моему, это
I don't. It's true. Remember where I said that? Probably just off the top of my head. I don't think I said that, but maybe I just don't remember.
Вряд ли будут вводиться. Ну, собственно говоря, так и происходит. Но, может быть, даже на удивление.
I said that new deposits wouldn't be commissioned at a certain oil price. Strictly speaking, that's what's happened.
Вот за последний год в нефтяники проинвестировали.
But maybe even surprisingly, our oil and gas companies, mainly the oil companies, are continuing to invest. In the past year, the oil companies have invested 1.5 trillion rubles. And if you take the state's investment in the pipeline network and electricity sector, then the overall investment in energy is 3.5 trillion rubles in the past year. This is quite significant.
And you're going to talk to the Saudi Deputy Crown Prince at the G20, Mohammed bin Salman. There's talk, would you still be in favour of a production freeze if the Saudis want that?
He's a very energetic state figure, and we really have struck up a good relationship. This is a man who knows what he wants and knows how to achieve his goals. But at the same time, I think he's a very reliable partner with whom you can reach agreements and can be certain that those agreements will be honored. But still, it wasn't us who rejected the idea of freezing output levels. It was our Saudi partners who at the last moment changed their view and decided to take a pause in taking this decision. But I want to repeat, our position hasn't changed, and if Prince Salman and I speak about this, then I shall, of course, put forward our position again. We believe that this is the right decision for the world energy. That's the first thing. The second thing is that everyone knows, what the dispute was all about. The dispute was that if production were to be frozen, then everyone should do it, including Iran. But we understand that Iran is starting from a very low level, related to the well-known sanctions against this country. It would be unfair to leave it at this sanctioned level. I think that from the viewpoint of economic sense and logic, it would be correct to find some sort of compromise. I'm not sure that everyone understands that. The issue isn't economic but political. I would very much like to hope that every market participant who is interested in maintaining stable and fair global energy prices will in the end make the necessary decision.
So you would be in favor of a production freeze, but giving Iran a little bit of leeway to do what they need to do?
Yes.
Can I ask you about privatization and oil again? The privatization of Bashneft. You delayed it, and now, as we reported, Igor Sechin of Rosneft has come forward and said he would like to buy half of it for $5 billion. But you have always said that you don't want the big state companies to be buying the newly privatized ones. So how could you wouldn't allow that, would you?
You spoke just now of state-run companies. Rosneft, strictly speaking, isn't a state company. Let's not forget that 19.7% of it belongs to BP, which, by the way, is a British company. You're a British subject, so you're also...
I think you may have more control over Rosneft than Theresa May has over BP.
Yes, maybe we have more control, but strictly speaking, it's not a state company. I wanted to say that I think this is a clear fact. 19.7% belongs to a foreign investor. But nevertheless, given that the controlling stake belongs to the state, probably it's not the best option when one company under state control acquires another purely state company. This is one position. Second is that in the final analysis, it's important for the budget who gives more money in the auctions that should be organized as part of the privatization process. And in this sense, we can't discriminate against market participants, not a single one of them. But it's not relevant at the moment, as the government decided to delay Bashneft's privatization.
But on the question of privatization, you said back in 2012 that you wanted to expand privatization. You've had a difficult time of it. Why has that not worked? And is there a case? Why does the Russian government need to own 50% of these companies? Maybe you could sell more.
The Russian government has no need to hold such large stakes, and we certainly intend to carry out our plans. The question is not whether we want to or not, it's whether it makes sense or not, and at what moment in time. On the whole, this makes sense at least from one point of view, from the standpoint of structural changes in the economy. The state really is perhaps too big in the Russian economy now. But in the falling market, even from the point of view of fiscal interests, it doesn't always make sense. So we're taking it carefully. But our trend, from the standpoint of privatization and the state's gradual withdrawal from certain assets, is unchanged and remains unchanged. By the way, you mentioned Rosneft. We are very busy preparing to privatize part of our Rosneft stake itself. This is the best confirmation that we haven't changed our fundamental plans.
So you would do Rosneft this year? You would sell those shares in Rosneft this year, you hope?
I don't know if the government can prepare and do this deal together with the management of Rosneft itself. if the appropriate strategic investors can be found. I think that we should be talking about precisely such investors, but we are preparing and planning to do the deal this year.
And do you, again, just to push you on that 50%, would you be happy in a world where the Russian state had less than 50% of these big companies?
I don't see anything horrible in this. You know, I remember that we had once a company, I won't name it now, but when 50% of it went to foreign shareholders, foreign investors, the contributions to the federal budget, tax payments increased several times immediately, and the company's efficiency didn't deteriorate at all. So from the viewpoint of the state's interests, the end interests of the state, from the standpoint of its fiscal interests, we have positive rather than negative experience.
Can I push you a bit on this? Because when I look at your record over all these years, in foreign policy, you have been very aggressive, very decisive, very bold. Everyone would agree on that. On economic policy, you seem a little bit more timid.
I don't agree with this. I don't agree.
Sorry, bold, yes.
I act decisively, but not aggressively.
I think.
I act in line with the circumstances that arise.
But on the economy, by contrast, you have been slightly more, you have been less decisive in terms of pushing reforms through. If you look at countries like China and Vietnam, you know, they have changed their economies completely. Russia, as you said, is still one dependent on oil, still dependent on a few companies, still run largely by the same people. Do you think that has been a sort of failing throughout the year, throughout those years, that you have not reformed enough?
No, I don't think so. And moreover, we held a land reform. It was hard to imagine in Russia that this would be possible. Wait a minute, listen. Unlike many countries in the world, with a very developed market economy, our, say, oil sector, it's almost fully privatized. You just mentioned Rosneft and Bashneft, and the rest are private companies. And look what's happening in this sector in Saudi Arabia, in Mexico, and in many other oil-producing countries. Why do you think Russia has made less progress towards these reforms? Another thing is that with high oil prices, it's very hard to redirect economic participants from those industries where they get big profits and to encourage them to invest money and resources in other areas. For this, you need to pursue a whole set of measures. We are doing just that gradually. Unfortunately, the effect may not be as significant as we would like it to be. A moment, let me finish. So look, the year before last, oil and gas revenue accounted for 53% of budget revenue. This is the year before last, in 2014, and in 2015 it was 43%, and this year it will be about 36%. So structural changes are also taking place. And it's not only about the price, but also about the distribution, economic growth, the expansion of certain industries.
But all the same, I know you are a generous man, but if you had a general who had lost 80% of his army, you might not keep him as a general. Gazprom still has the export monopoly. You wouldn't think of taking it away from them given that performance, because it is worse than other gas companies.
Listen, that's a different story. If we were talking about the general, then the general, in this case, would have lost nothing, but be sent to the reserves, which at any moment could be in demand and used.
Coming up, talking Trump. Putin weighs in on the US election.
They are both using shock tactics, just each in their own way.
This is Bloomberg. The fall of the Iron Curtain brought with it a warming of relations between Russia and the West. By 1997, the country had been invited into the exclusive group of industrial nations, with the G7 becoming the G8. But his backing of Syrian President Assad, together with the annexation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, has seen all that change. Russia is under sanctions and is being kicked out of the G8 club. If I had to look at the West, I think at the root of their distrust is the idea that they think that you want to expand Russia's zone of influence, in some cases geographically, but also at the very least to control the countries on your border. And at the moment, the main area of nervousness on that is the Baltics, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. You talked about the trust. Would you be able to say something that would give them reassurance on that count?
Слушайте, я думаю, что все
Listen, I think that right-thinking people who really are involved in politics understand that the idea of a Russian threat to, for example, the Baltics is complete rubbish. Are we really about to fight NATO? How many people live in NATO? About 600 million, correct? There are 146 million in Russia. Yes, we are the biggest nuclear power. But do you really think that we are about to conquer the Baltics using nuclear weapons? What's this rubbish? That's the first point, but by no means the main point. The main point is something completely different. We have great political experience, which consists of our being deeply convinced that you cannot do anything against the will of the people. And some of our partners appear not to understand this. When they remember about Crimea, they try not to notice that the will of the people living in Crimea, where 70% of them are ethnic Russians and the rest speak Russian like their native tongue, was to join Russia. They simply try not to see this. In one place, Kosovo, you can use the will of the people, but not here. This is all a political game. So, to give reassurances, I can say Russia has pursued and plans to pursue an absolutely peaceful foreign policy directed towards cooperation. As far as expanding our zone of influence is concerned, it took me 9 hours to fly to Vladivostok from Moscow. This is a little less than from Moscow to New York, through all of Western Europe and the Atlantic Ocean. Do you think we need to expand something? The question is not at all about territory. And in terms of influence, yes, we would like Russia's influence to be more noticeable, more significant. But we are putting absolutely peaceful and positive content into this. Economic influence, humanitarian influence, the influence derived from developing equal cooperation with our neighbors. And this is what our foreign policy is aimed at. And no one should doubt this.
You mentioned Crimea, you mentioned what happened there. In terms of the reassurances you might give, is back then on March the 4th, 2014, which 3 times our reporter asked you, what is happening inside the Crimea? Did you know anything about the Russian troops which were taking over the Ukrainian government? And you said no, you knew nothing about that, nor the military bases. Then a year later, you talked about directing the operation to bring Crimea home yourself. Do you accept that sometimes you could have maybe said things in a much clearer way when they were actually happening?
Of course, I have already commented on these things on many occasions. There is nothing simpler than that. I have already spoken about it. Yes, our servicemen guaranteed safe voting and the referendum. If we had not done this, then we would have been confronted with a worse tragedy than the burning alive of people in the trades union house in Odessa. When nationalists surrounded defenseless, unarmed people and burned them alive, this would have been widespread in Crimea. We did not allow this to happen. That people came themselves to the polling stations and voted is a fact. No one would have gone to the polling stations under the train of a machine gun. It's so obvious that you can't argue with it. Come to Crimea yourself now, take a walk and everything will become clear. And that's the end of the matter. So yes, our troops were in Crimea. We didn't even access the numbers of our units that were there in accordance with our agreements with Ukraine. But the most important thing can be found in something completely different. The most important thing is that the Crimea parliament voted for the referendum and then for independence, which had been elected 2 years previously under Ukrainian law. In other words, this was an entirely legitimate body representing the people living in Crimea. So we acted entirely in accordance with international law, the United Nations Charter, and on the basis of democratic principles. And this, above all, is nothing more than the people expressing their will.
as you well know, there is an American election underway. There is a choice in that between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Who would you rather have at the other end of the telephone?
Мне бы хотелось иметь дело с человеком, который
I would like to work with a person who can make responsible decisions and implement any agreements that we reach.
исполняет достигнутые договоренности.
Their last name doesn't matter. Of course, it's necessary for that person to enjoy the trust of the American people, so that they won't just have the desire, but also is backed by the political will to fulfill all those agreements. Therefore, we never intervened and do not intervene and are trying not to intervene in domestic political processes. We will closely monitor what happens and wait for the election results. And then we will be ready to work with any administration if it itself wants that.
Can I just push you on that? Back in 2011, you accused Hillary Clinton of seeking to trigger the protests that you were facing in Russia at the time. And by contrast, I was just looking at some of the things that Donald Trump has said about you. Back in 2007, he said Putin's doing a great job. In 2011, he praised your no-nonsense way. Next year, he said you were his new best friend. Next year, he said you were outsmarting the Americans. He said you have good ratings together. I could go on and on like that. But are you really telling me that if you have a choice between a woman who you think may have been trying to get rid of you and a man who seems to have this sort of great affection for you, almost sort of bordering on the homoerotic, you're really going to go for, you're not going to make a decision between those two, because one of them would seem to be a lot more favorable towards you?
Ну, вы знаете, я уже по сути ответил на ваш вопрос.
You know, I essentially already answered your question. I will reformulate it again in different words.
Работать с любым президентом, но
We are ready to work with any president, but of course, I want to say that it depends on how ready the future administration is.
если кто-то говорит, что
If someone says that they want to work with Russia, we will welcome it. And if some, as you said, although it may be a poor translation, wants to get rid of us, that will be a completely different approach.
мы это переживем. Здесь неизвестно, кто
But we
больше
will
потеряет
survive it,
при таком
and it's not clear who has more to lose at that approach.
неоднократно видел, что
But you know what it is. I have repeatedly seen the anti-Russian card played during domestic political campaigns in the States.
я считаю, что это очень недальновидно.
I think that it's a very short-sighted approach. At the same time, they send us all sorts of signals from all sides that actually things are just fine.
администрациях так было в ходе предвыборных кампаний, что мы
In
там
previous administrations, that's the way it was during the campaign.
Мне кажется, что это
We will restore
не
everything
отвечает
later.
тому уровню ответственности.
You know, it seems to me that it doesn't fully meet the level of responsibility that lies on the shoulders of the US.
более
I think that all this should be more dignified, calm, more balanced.
кто-то критикует, вы знаете, и со стороны
In regards to that someone is criticizing us, you know, criticism is leveled at us by Mr. Trump's team as well.
например, один из
For example, one of the members of his team said that Russia allegedly paid money to the Clinton family via some foundations.
семье Клинтон,
What's that? Does it mean that we control the Clinton family?
мы руководим, значит, семьей Клинтон.
It's complete nonsense. I don't even know how it was sent, through what funds.
Это просто
So both one side and the other side are using it as a tool in a domestic political struggle. And that's bad in my opinion. But obviously, when someone says that they want to work with Russia, we will welcome it, regardless of what last name that person has.
и вне зависимости от того, как фамилия этого человека.
Can I ask you one last question on Donald Trump? Some people say that he is too volatile to be an American president. You would be happy with him as American president in the same way as you would be happy with Hillary Clinton in that role?
Вы знаете, не можем
You know, we can't answer for the American people.
при всем эпатаже
After all, with all the shocking tactics of not only one but the other candidate, they are both busy using shocking tactics, just each in their own way.
они очень умные люди, и тот, и другой.
They are smart, they are very smart people. They understand which buttons you need to press a bit so that the voters of the United States understand, feel and listen to them.
Почувствовали и услышали избиратели в самих Соединенных Штатах. Трамп делает упор
Trump is focusing on the traditional Republican electorate,
так на среднего
people with average incomes, the working class, a select group of entrepreneurs, and people that support traditional
людей,
values.
которые придерживаются традиционных ценностей. Клинтон
Mrs. Clinton is focusing on a different part of the electorate and is trying to influence them in her own way. So that's why they attack each other.
друг на друга нападают.
In some cases, I would want us to follow their lead.
Мы брали с них пример
I don't think they are setting the best example.
Думаю, что это не самый лучший пример, который они подают. Но такова политическая культура.
But that's the US political culture. You have to just accept it as it is.
Америка великая страна.
America is a powerful country, and it has earned the right that nobody outside can interfere with it or comment on it.
Отвечая на ваш вопрос в третий раз, могу
To answer your question for a third time, we will work with any administration, with any president who will win the support of the American people.
Если, конечно, он сам
If, of course, they are ready to cooperate with Russia.
сотрудничает с Россией.
The other accusation you've faced is that people connected with Russia or backed by Russia were the people who hacked into the Democratic Party's database. That you would also say is completely untrue.
Я об этом ничего не знаю. Знаете, столько много хакеров.
No, I don't know anything about that. You know how many hackers there are today, and they are so delicate and precise that they can leave their mark at the necessary time and place or camouflage their activities as if it were some other hackers from another territory or country.
Каких-то других хакеров из других территорий.
It's extremely difficult to check, if it's even possible to verify.
Трудно проверяемые вещи, если вообще возможно.
In any case, we definitely do not do this on a state level. And then, listen, is it really even important who hacked this data from the election headquarters of Mrs. Clinton? Is that really important?
Разве это важно?
The important thing is the content was given to the public.
Того, что было предъявлено общественности. Вокруг этого должна вестись дискуссия.
There should be a discussion about this. And there's no need to distract the public's attention from the essence of the problem by raising some side issues connecting with the search for who did it.
Поиском того, кто это сделал. Но хочу вам еще раз сказать.
But I want to tell you again, I don't know anything about it. And on a state level, Russia has never done this. And honestly, to be perfectly open, I can't even imagine that this sort of information is of interest to American society. Specifically, that the campaign headquarters worked in the interest of one of the candidates, in this case Mrs. Clinton, rather than equally for all of the Democratic Party candidates. It would simply not even occur to me that this could be interesting to anyone. So even from this point of view, we couldn't have been officially mixed up in this. Understanding that, to do that, you need to feel the nerve and the peculiarities of the domestic political life of the US. I'm not sure that even our foreign ministry experts are that sensitive.
President Erdogan, you didn't protest that much when Turkish tanks rolled across the Syrian border the other day. Why? Do you think Turkey has now moved closer to your idea that the future of Syria has to involve President Assad staying in some way? Or have you changed your mind about President Erdogan? Only a little bit ago you were complaining that you had been stabbed in the back and you had the problems to do with the jet being shot down. Has something changed in Turkey in terms of what you can see?
First off, we are starting from the fact that Turkey apologized for the incident that took place and for the death of our people. It did it directly, without any reservations, and we value that. President Erdogan went ahead with that. We see a clear interest on the part of Turkey's president to restore complete relations with Russia. We have many common interests in the Black Sea area and on the global level, and in the Middle East. We very much count on that we will be able to establish a constructive dialogue. We have many big projects, including Turkish Stream in the energy sector. And I think that in the final account, we will achieve them, at least the first part relating to increasing deliveries, expanding transport capacity, and boosting deliveries to the domestic Turkish market. There will be the possibility of transit to European partners, again if they want it, and if the European Commission supports it. We have a very large project to build a nuclear power station on unique terms. They consist of several elements. We will finance, own and operate it. Its singularity gives us reason to believe that the project will be implemented and will take into account the agreements on its economic parameters that set the price of a kilowatt-hour of energy. This will be an economically advantageous project for both sides. In addition to everything else, as I already said, We have a mutual desire to come to an agreement about the region's problems, including the Syrian problem. I once thought and continue to believe that nothing can be decided from outside about the political regime or a change of power. When I hear from the outside that some president must leave, not from inside the country but from outside it, it raises major questions for me. I'm simply sure, and I get this confidence from the events of the last decade, specifically the attempts at democratizing Iraq. We see that in fact led to the collapse of the statehood and growth of terrorism. Where do you see elements of democracy there? Maybe they will emerge eventually. I very much count on it. Or will the civil war continue in Iraq? And what will happen in general with Iraq in the future? So far, these are big questions. It's the same with Syria. When we hear that Assad should leave, and for some reason someone from the outside believes that, I have a big question. What will it lead to? Will it correspond with international legal standards, and what will it lead to? Isn't it better to be patient and facilitate changes to the structure of the society itself, to master this patience, allowing changes to the structure of the society, waiting for them these changes happen naturally within the country? Of course it won't happen today or tomorrow. Maybe that's what political wisdom is. Not fussing and getting ahead of yourself, but gradually working towards structural change, in this case within the society's political system. In regards to Turkey's actions, we are in contact with our Turkish partners and we consider everything that violates international law is unacceptable.
Very quickly on Syria, are we any closer to having a Russian-American deal about how a plan for what to happen with Syria? You've had talks recently. It seems as if you've got a little bit closer, but is there any progress on that, and do you think we're closer to that than we have been?
You know, the talks are very difficult. One of the key problems is that we insist, and our American partners are not opposed to this, that the so-called healthy part of the opposition should be distinguished from the radical groupings and terrorist organizations, such as Jabhat al-Nusra. While we have an impression that Jabhat al-Nusra are hiding under other names, they already call themselves differently, but in fact haven't changed at all. They start to observe this so-called healthy part of opposition, and there's nothing good in this. Besides, this is not an element of internal conflict. These are outside fighters who get arms and ammunition from abroad. And in essence, our American partners agree with it, but they don't know what to do about it. Nevertheless, despite all these difficulties, we're on the right path, and I have to mention that Secretary of State Kerry has certainly done colossal work. I'm surprised by both his patience and at the same time determination. But nevertheless, in my opinion, we are gradually heading in the right direction. And I don't rule out that we'll be able to agree on something in the near future and present our agreements to the international community. It's too early to talk about this, but I think, as I said, we are working in the necessary direction.
Coming up next, what's in Russia's future?
As strange as this may sound, you shouldn't cling to it. You shouldn't try to remain in your position at any cost.
This is Bloomberg. Mr. Putin has described the fall of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Since rising to power at the end of the last century, he has styled himself as a guardian of both Russia and its interests. He has moved from president to prime minister and then back again to president. But whatever he has done, power has stayed with him. Can we ask you one last set of questions about your legacy? Have you yet decided if you will run in the presidential elections of 2018?
We are now on the brink of parliamentary elections. We need to hold these elections to see the results. But after this, there will be another in almost 2 years. So it's far too early to speak about this.
говорить об этом абсолютно преждевременно. Это, знаете, в современном быстро...
In the modern, rapidly changing world, it's simply damaging to talk about this. We need to work to make sure the plans and tasks we set ourselves are completed.
того, чтобы были реализованы планы.
We need to raise the quality of people's lives, develop the economy, social sphere, and increase the country's defensive capabilities.
Социальная сфера, повышение обороноспособности страны, в зависимости от...
Depending on the solutions to these tasks, then we can see how to organize the presidential election campaign in 2018 and who should take part.
И кто должен принять в ней участие.
I haven't yet made a decision for myself.
Do you think Russia is getting easier to run or harder?
Проще, чем когда. При Иване Грозном...
Simply than when? In Ivan the Terrible's time, Nicholas II's, Brezhnev's, Khrushchev's?
In your time, since...
Я думаю, что сложнее, потому что все-таки при всей критике...
I think it's more complicated because, despite all the criticism of our Western partners, we are developing processes of domestic democracy. At these elections, there are significantly more parties going to take part than in previous years, and this will obviously leave its mark on the course and result of the campaign.
Будет накладывать отпечаток на ход и результаты избирательных кампаний.
There is a practical dimension. We now see that the rating of our leading political force, the United Russia Party, slid a little, and many people are asking, what's up, what's going on, what's happened? Clearly, it's the start of a proactive election campaign. And the large number of parties that are now taking part in the election process, they are all on television screens, in the media, and in the newspapers. And what do they have to offer? They all criticize the authorities.
Телевизоров, средства массовой информации, в газеты. А с чем они выходят? Они все критикуют власть.
They, meanwhile, don't say how to make things better, and even say such things that even a person who has shallow views would find barely realistic and sometimes totally unfeasible.
Но зато они очень красиво смотрят.
But then they look great on the television. They criticize and pour scorn on the representatives of the ruling party. But they don't say if they are ready to take responsibility for taking some not very popular but ultimately necessary decisions.
Are you envious of the Chinese who don't have to go through these elections?
В Китае другая.
There is a different political system in China, and it's a different country. I don't think you'd like to see 1.5 billion people sense some sort of a disorder in their country and in their government. So let's give the Chinese the right and the possibility to decide how to organize their country and their society.
Россия другая страна. У нас другие.
Russia is a different country. We have different processes, different developmental level of the political system's development. It's a different quality. It's not about the level per se. It's about the quality of the political system. But it's growing and it's becoming more complex.
И мне бы очень хотелось, чтобы и в будущем эта система укреплялась.
In fact, it makes me happy, and I'd like for the system to become stronger so that we have a balance in our political system that would allow it to be always in an effective state and aimed at progress.
В таком дееспособном состоянии и быть нацелены на развитие.
You've just reorganized part of your government. You've promoted some people, some former bodyguards and people like that. Do you think that might be the sort of area where the next leader from Russia will come? Will it come from this younger generation of people who are beginning to emerge?
Да, конечно. Я исхожу из того, что...
Yes, of course. I think that the future leader has to be a young person.
Достаточно молодой.
Be a young man like Alexei Dumin or someone like that.
Ну, но зрелым.
But also a mature person. As for the members of the various special forces and the military, there is nothing new here.
Никакой новизны здесь нет. У нас не в первый раз.
This is not the first time that we have members of the Defense Ministry and the Federal Security Service being promoted to a regional administration.
Ну, не исключением является, скажем, Федеральная служба охраны, чем они хуже.
The Federal Guard Service shouldn't be an exception. Why are they any worse? The most important thing is that the right person wants to grow, is capable of growing, and wants to serve the country in his sphere or work with wider powers and more responsibility.
И если он хочет, и я вижу, что...
And if he wants, and I can see that the person has potential, then why not let him work? And then, after all, representatives of regional governments will also have to participate in elections and allow the citizens of the region to judge their proposals, get to know their programs, them personally.
население того или другого региона. Нужно, чтобы люди посмотрели, познакомились с этими программами, с человеком познакомились.
There must be a relationship between the head of the region and the people who live there. The people must have a feel for what kind of person the potential leader is. And if they vote for him, for me that means that they trust him.
Будущего руководителя. И если уж будут за него голосовать, я исхожу из того, что будут ему доверять, иначе я не проголосую.
You just referred to the system surviving after you. The people might say there were two ways in which Russia is very difficult to rule. One is it's a very personal system at the moment. Many people vote for you rather than for a party. And the other region is Russia is still a fairly lawless place. You still have difficulties in Chechnya. You have the things like the murder of Boris Nemtsov, which I know you've condemned and you've brought people in, but the people, whatever mastermind is still being sought. Is Russia a very, very hard place to govern at the moment?
Вы знаете, любой страной сложно управлять. Я вас уверяю, что...
Any country is hard to govern, believe me. Do you think the US is easy to govern? Is it easy to solve what seem to be simple tasks such as, say, Guantanamo? President Obama said in his first term that he would close Guantanamo, but it's still open. He doesn't want to close it?
Я уверен, что хочет.
Of course he wants to. I'm certain that he wants to. But 1,000 things come up that don't let him completely settle the matter. Speaking of which, that's actually bad, but that's another topic.
Любой страной сложно управлять. И даже очень маленькой страной. Вопрос...
Any country is hard to govern, even a very small country. It's not a question of whether the country is large or small, it's a question of how you relate to the work, to what extent you feel responsible for it.
И политической системы, и становление рыночных принципов экономики.
Russia is also hard to govern. Russia is at the development stage of both its political system and the restoration of market principles in the economy. It's a complicated process, but very interesting. Russia actually is not just a large country, it's a great country. I mean its traditions and its cultural particularities. Yes, there are particularities and traditions in the political sphere. Why hide it?
Сразу наступили коммунистические времена.
We all well know that we had an absolute monarchy, and then almost immediately the communist period began. The base broadened a bit, but to a certain degree the management system became even more harsh. It was only in the 1990s that we moved towards building a completely different system of domestic politics, a multi-party system, and that's also a difficult, ambiguous process. You can't skip over steps of it. You need the public to get used to it, so that they felt their own responsibility then going to vote, so that they don't put their faith in populist decisions or reasoning, or one group of candidates that's just bashing another group. The public needs to analyze what's being proposed by the candidates. That goes for elections to parliament, and it goes for presidential elections.
Но, кстати говоря, там, где четкая...
In places where it's a clear presidential system of government, people generally tend to vote not so much for the party as for the president's candidate. It's like that almost everywhere. So there's nothing unusual in our country's situation.
Ничего необычного в положении в нашей стране нет.
Can I ask you a personal thing? You've managed to rule Russia for 16 years. If you look at the chief executives and the business people who tune in to Bloomberg and watch it, very few of them last longer than 5 years, 6 years. What advice would you give them to hang on to their jobs for longer?
Как это ни странно прозвучит.
As strange as this may sound, you shouldn't cling to it. You shouldn't try to remain in your position at any cost. After all, I wasn't, as you said, here for 16 years. I was president of the Russian Federation for 8 years, and then, not violating the constitution, not changing it for myself, I simply didn't run for a third term, which was impossible under the constitution. Our constitution says we can run for 2 consecutive terms. That's what I did. I was elected to 2 terms, and then I simply left for a different job. I worked for 4 years as a prime minister. According to the constitution, I had the right, and after 4 years, I ran again for the presidency. And I was elected, and I'm working now. So it's not 16 years. It's 4 and 4, 8, and now 4.
But what is the reason for your success?
As for length, one of the Canadian prime ministers, I think, was in power for 16 years. The German Chancellor, how long has she been in power, if we are talking about the top job in the executive branch?
Not 16 years. You have done longer than most.
Так и я не 16, я 12.
And I haven't been for 16 years, I've been for 12. For her, I think it's not less.
Я не знаю, какие здесь могут быть секреты. У меня секретов нет. Я просто всегда стараюсь.
And that's not the main thing. I don't know how there could be secrets here. I try to sense the mood of the people, their needs, their attitude towards ways to solve problems, their priorities. That's mainly what I go by.
Их настрой на форумы, на спорт.
And I think that's the most important thing in a person's work, in the work that the people of Russia entrusted in me.
И мне думается, что вот это самое главное в работе любого человека, который занимается той работой, которую народ России доверил мне.
You look around the world at the moment, and there are so many countries have become dynasties. You have the Clintons and the Bushes in America. You have, as you say, on your southern fringe, a lot of people. You have children who you have very successfully kept out of the public eye. Would you ever want your daughters to go into politics? Would you want them to have the same life as you?
Я не считаю себя вправе хотеть чего-то за них.
I don't think I have the right to wish something for them. They are young, but already adults. They should determine their futures themselves.
В целом, насколько я себе представляю, они уже выбрали.
On the whole, to the extent I see it, they've already made those choices. They're doing science and some other things that are absolutely noble and needed by people. They feel needed, they get joy from their work, and that makes me very happy.
И меня это очень радует.
One last question. When I flew here, I had a choice of two films to watch. One was Dr. Zhivago, and the other was The Godfather. Which would you recommend for somebody trying to understand Russia?
Ну, не знаю. Вы знаете.
You know, we have a well-known phrase, Russia cannot be understood with the mind alone. No ordinary yardstick can span her greatness. She stands alone unique. In Russia, one can only believe.
Культура, она многогранна и многообразна.
Russian culture is multifaceted and diverse. So if you want to understand, to feel Russia, then of course you need to read books, Tolstoy and Chekhov and Gogol and Turgenev and others. Listen to music, Tchaikovsky, watch our classical ballet. But the most important thing is that you need to talk with people.
Я вас уверяю, как вы только начнете вот встречаться с обычными рядовыми гражданами.
Believe me, when you start to meet with ordinary people, you understand that a Russian person, a person of Russia, a Tatar, a Mordvin, a Chechen, a Dagestani, they are very open people, even a little naive.
Открытые, даже немного наивные.
But there's one defining trait that probably all peoples have, although it comes out especially strongly in us. It's a striving for justice.
У всех народов есть, но у нас она особенно ярко выражена. Это стремление к справедливости.
It's one of the dominating, I think, traits in the mentality of a person from Russia, a Russian person.
Мне кажется, в менталитете россиянина и русского человека. И
And another thing that is characteristic for the Russian mentality is the drive towards something, and of course I'm speaking generally. We have millions of people, but on average...
Конечно, это, знаете, это общая черта такая. У нас миллионы людей, все люди разные, но в среднем все-таки мы, конечно,
We of course want to be materially well off, and I will try to do everything that I possibly can so that people live better, so that their quality of life improves. But despite all that, in the soul of a Russian person, there is always a drive towards some kind of a lofty moral ideal, lofty moral values.
К какому-то высокому моральному идеалу, к каким-то высоким моральным ценностям. Это нас точно.
That definitely sets us apart, and I'm certain it's in a good way.
That sounds like Dr. Zhivago to me. President Putin, thank you very much for talking to us. You've been very generous with your time.